Ms. Gargos, when you're ready.
The truth, that would have been your more accurate recollection then.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can we move on to the next page, please? I was starting to get my bearings again, and I remember wiping my face or eyes on Craig's T-shirt. That's what you told us earlier. I had got down on the ground to help restrain the boy as he was still struggling. The officers were struggling to keep him on the ground. There were no punches from what I could see. So at that time, when you get down on the ground, Mr. Bio is still struggling, and the officers are struggling to keep him on the ground. And then Ashley, and that's Ashley Tomlinson, and Alan Smith, incidentally, he was at the muster. I forgot to mention him. I think it was Alan Smith. I was still a bit disoriented. They were at the guy's feet or legs end of his body. The guy was still struggling at this point. So it would appear that when you gave this statement, you remembered that Tomlinson and Smith were at Mr. Bio's feet or legs at that end of the body. Would that be correct?
Waist, the legs.
Waist. So thinking back now, you think it was more at the waist end. But when you gave this statement to Perk, is it correct to say that you thought he was at his feet, Mr. Bio's feet or legs end of the body?
I don't know.
You're not clear
Sure,
now in your recollection. And then it says, Ashley, Alan and Craig are big guys and they were struggling to control him. I remember hearing the guys talking about trying to get control enough to try and get handcuffs onto him. I remember saying link the handcuffs or something like that. I'm still struggling at this point. My eyes were still streaming and my nose was running. When you refer to still struggling at this point, are you referring to the way you're feeling because of the spray or the...
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I remember that Craig was still at the top end chest of the guy. I saw Craig get lifted by the guy. He was lifting Craig with his body weight. Craig is about 25 stones. I cannot emphasise the strength of this guy. Alan is an ex-Marine. Ashley is a big guy as well. I'm thinking to myself, if he gets back onto his feet, then we've got real problems as well. Do you remember that now that you see it? And what were you thinking at this time? What was going through your mind?
This boy's on something like Flaca.
Why do you say that?
Because it gives us... I've looked at it on YouTube before this.
Before May 2015?
And it does give you superpower strength.
Right. And you say he, Mr. Bio, was lifting Craig with his body weight. What did that mean? Where it says Mr. Bio was lifting Craig with his body weight.
Basically, being able to sort of sit up, get his body, Bio's body off the ground,
Right.
and in turn lift Craig off the ground.
Right. And you mention Alan Smith and you mention Ashley Tomlinson and their size as well. Was he also trying to lift them off the ground?
Yeah.
Mr. Bio?
Everybody was struggling to restrain him.
Right.
There was 4 people involved, and they were struggling to restrain him.
And
This is that boy, let's face it, he had muscles, he took steroids. His shoulders were huge, his arms were huge, his chest was huge. He's obviously good at bench pressing. The 4 guys that were trying to restrain him were struggling to control him.
And you're including yourself in that. And at this point, was this when you were using your baton? Or the baton, I should say, not your baton.
Round about that time, aye.
Right. I heard the guys at the legs of the guy talking about leg restraints. I did not see them apply leg restraints. At this point, I was at the left shoulder of the body facing towards Craig's back. I was trying to hold the left area of his body. It was a muscular bicep. He was still definitely struggling at this point with me and the other officers. Can you explain what you meant when you say you were at the left shoulder of the body facing towards Craig's back? What was happening then?
I've explained it already.
All right. Okay.
Have I not? That's just in relation to my positioning, whether it be right or wrong. Craig being opposite me, and Craig's back was what I was wiping.
You mentioned earlier it was his left arm, at the back of his arm. Is that what you're referring to?
Aye.
Thank you. Then I saw a baton ASP. It had been extended. What's a baton ASP?
One of them, an asp.
All right, ASP. Had been extended. It was not my baton. My baton has a smooth handle. This had ribs down it. In fact, that's what you've told us earlier. And then if we can come up the page, please. The baton was lying on the ground at the back of Craig's legs. I picked up the baton and put it across the boy's bicep. I had the baton across the boy's bicep. I was holding both ends of the baton, and I was in a push-up position with my whole body weight, with the pressure on the baton over the boy's bicep, but he was still struggling. So can I just say, you stop there and say, the baton was lying on the ground at the back of Craig's legs, and you picked it up. How did you pick it up from that position at the back of Craig's legs?
That's what I said. I said that Craig was lying on his left-hand side, at the sort of upper torso of Bayou. Craig's back was to me. Craig's back was towards Bayou's face, so his back, his legs would be joined onto his.
Did you lean over to pick that up off the ground?
Aye.
Yeah, thank you. And then it says, I know that this is not a trained method of restraint, but in the circumstances I was trying to bring him under control to assist with keeping in control and for handcuffs to be put on him. And is that what you said earlier?
Yeah, you'll do anything that's required in a situation like that.
At this point, I then became aware of Danny Gibson, DC Derek Connell, DS Samantha Davidson and Scott Maxwell being on the scene, and other police vehicles being there as well. I have no idea from what direction they came from or who had arrived in that vehicle. I think it was about 30 seconds to a minute that I was personally struggling with the guy on the ground. I don't remember seeing any other officer discharge CS or PAVA at the man, although I do believe that Ashley did from a conversation after the event. At no point did I strike him with a baton. I never saw anyone strike the guy with a baton. Would you agree with all of that?
Yeah.
Thank you. Then move on to the next page. I do not remember seeing any officer place the guy in leg restraints. I'm fairly certain that I saw the leg restraints being taken off the guy. I do not remember seeing any of the officers place him in handcuffs. I don't remember seeing him in handcuffs. It was whilst, and just before we move on, I do not remember seeing any officer place the guy in leg restraints. You've told us that already today. And then you mention not remembering seeing him in handcuffs. And do you remember seeing him in handcuffs at any point, or do you not?
No.
No. It was whilst I was still holding his bicep with the baton, I noticed there was no resistance with regard to him trying to lift up his arm. I am only really conscious of his arm. I could not really see the rest of the torso because of Craig's back. The guy did not speak or scream throughout the incident. So, do you remember saying this to Perk at the time?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so it says, whilst I was still holding his bicep with the baton, I noticed there was no resistance with regard to him trying to lift up his arm. So was this the moment, the point at which you noticed no resistance coming from Mr. Bio?
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember now whether he was moving in other parts of his body at that time?
No.
Do you remember what the other officers were doing at this moment in time?
No.
Alan said at this point, is that PC Smith?
Yes.
Alan. He must have stood up at the head end and said, is he still breathing? He was standing at the guy's left-hand side of the head end. He was just in front of me. Alan then said, aye, he is. I looked at the guy, and in my opinion, he was still breathing. I said, aye, he's still breathing. I could see movement in his skin. I just thought that he was still conscious. I did not get down and check for breaths. Craig was still lying on top of the guy at this point. I was still on the ground with the guy. So let me just ask you about that paragraph. You've noticed with the bicep and the baton that there's no resistance. And at that point, Alan asked the question, is he still breathing? So was that at the stage that it would appear to others he'd stopped moving?
Possibly.
He was, and Alan Smith says he's still breathing. I could see movement in his skin. What does that mean?
Chest rises.
Right. So you could see that he was still breathing because of the physical movement. And you thought I just thought he was still conscious. What made you say conscious? You say you thought he was still conscious. You see,
That's maybe that's likely a mistake.
Right. What did you actually mean to say
He
at that?
was still breathing.
He was still breathing, but not conscious. Right. Craig was still lying on top of the guy at this point. I was still on the ground with the guy. Would that be your recollection at the time?
Yeah.
Alan is an officer safety trainer and qualified in first aid. He did my last refresher course as well. He's very methodical as well. I remember thinking, if that's good enough for Alan, then that's good enough for me. And what did you mean by that?
He's just one of the most competent cops I've worked with. He's so methodical and does everything by the book. If it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me.
Okay. I remember something along the lines where Alan said, I don't think he is breathing, or something to that effect. I looked at that airwaves transmission from PC Smith earlier with you, where he said he was no longer breathing. Would that have been around the time that you remember PC Smith saying what you said there?
Probably about that.
At that point, everybody backed off him and he continued to lie on the ground. He wasn't moving. So after PC Smith has said, I don't think he's breathing, you say there everyone backed off him. What do you mean by that?
Just to us, maybe some people, I believe I was one of them, although I can't remember it, stood up. People took a step back, even though they were kneeling down, just backed off, just gave him that bit of space.
Gave him space. And he was definitely not moving at that stage.
No.
And you were looked at a map. I won't go to the map. You see, I can't remember who or at what point an ambulance was called. Alan said, we're going to start CPR. I was quite happy that he was taking the lead role, as he is the expert in this. We've heard that he's trained in first aid and that type of thing. And then it says Craig identified that he was going to be doing the chest compressions. Alan identified that he was going to be putting the breaths in. And you've mentioned earlier PC Smith attempting to put in rescue breaths. Is that what you mean by that? I identified that I was going to hold the mask. I am talking about the mask with the one-way valve thing. And I took out the face mask from my vest. Can I ask you just about this paragraph? It appears from what you're describing there that everybody had a role identified. Who was it that was in charge of that, of things at that time?
Alan Smith, closely followed by Craig Walker and myself.
Right. I took out the mask from my vest. These are with me at all times whilst I'm on duty. I opened the package and tried to get the valve into the boy's mouth, but I was unable to do so because his teeth were clenched shut. I remember slapping the guy on the side of the face twice to attempt to rouse him. This had no reaction at all. I could not get the valve between his teeth as they were clenched shut. So, although you say in this statement, or it says in this statement, you were slapping the guy on the side of the face twice, that's the demonstration you gave earlier.
Caused no injury. caused very little pain. It was just to try and get a pain reaction.
And did you get that reaction?
No.
And then if we can move up, I tried to get my fingers between his teeth to get his mouth open, but was unable to do so, and also to force his jaw open. Again, this was unsuccessful. You've told us that earlier. I was aware at that point that an ambulance had been called for because I heard someone say, "Where the fuck's the ambulance?" I do not remember who said that. Around about the same time, I remember hearing Ashley say, "I hit the boy off the back of the head with my baton." I believe he said this for the benefit of Acting Sergeant Scott Maxwell, who was present and was passing back radio transmissions. Do you remember how long Sergeant Maxwell had been present by that time?
I'd be guessing about a minute maybe.
Okay. At this point, I was kneeling at the guy's left-hand side trying to get the mask in. On hearing this, I put my left hand behind the guy's head and felt around the guy's head. I did not feel any swelling to the head, nor did I see any blood on my hand that felt around his head. There was a small amount of blood above one of his ears. I cannot remember which one. It was from a cut or a graze. I think you mentioned that earlier. And then you say, presumably I could not get the valve in because of his teeth. I tried to create a seal around his mouth. Alan tried to get a couple of breaths in, but he couldn't. There was no chest rises that I could see. So at this point in time, you can no longer see the movement in the chest that you mentioned.
There's no air going in. So.
Right. I tried to raise his neck higher with my left hand and to form a seal around the valve. Alan tried a good few times go get breaths in via the valve. The mask was covered in saliva, CS, etc. Alan said he was getting contaminated, and Alan said we'll just go to compressions. Craig started compressions and kept going until he was tired. This was for a couple of minutes. I remember Craig saying to Scott Maxwell, "That's a couple of ribs away." It was repeated numerous times where the ambulance had got to, but I cannot remember who said that. Can I ask you about this sentence? I remember Craig saying to Scott Maxwell, "That's a couple of ribs away." What do you mean by that? What's that a reference to?
Well, they say that if you're doing CPR right, that there's a high probability that you'll break ribs for doing compressions. I know that from watching evidence that the rib in question, the nurse's opinion is that wouldn't be from CPR, but I certainly, from what I heard when Craig was doing it, to me did sound like a rib had been broken.
You actually heard the rib, or heard what you thought was a rib fracturing?
Yes.
And how long had CPR been going on when you heard that?
30 seconds.
It then says, I then took over chest compressions, and that's from PC Walker. And I kept going until the ambulance arrived a couple of minutes later. So really, it's PC Walker first of all doing the compressions, and then you. And you continued until the ambulance arrived at the scene.
Yeah.
When the ambulance arrived, I gave the paramedic technicians an update of what had happened and went back and sat in the van. Is that your van, the transit?
Yeah.
Then Craig came back to the van moments later. It was then agreed by everybody that we would muster back at the station. When you say it was agreed by everybody that we would muster back at the station, what do you mean? How was that agreement reached?
I don't know. Scott Maxwell speaks of speaking to me at the van. I can't recall that.
You don't remember that conversation?
No.
How were you feeling at the time?
Completely and utterly in shock.
And was the spray still having an impact?
Spray stays with you for your clothes and everything are contaminated. Spray stays with you until you change your clothes for at least half an hour afterwards. I was in complete shock because I thought I was going to be killed. I realised how close I had come to being killed. So I was just in complete and utter panic.
Right. So you've no recollection of that conversation with
No,
Sergeant?
but I've no reason to
No. To doubt
to
it?
doubt that it did happen.
Thank you. I do not know who went in the ambulance with the guy to the hospital. I do not remember if anyone assisted the ambulance crew. The ambulance stopped between where I was on the ground and my van. I did not see anything after that. Craig and I returned to the police office in the same van we arrived in. Craig was driving. There is CCTV in the van I was in, I believe. I'm not sure if it was operational or if it was records, or if it records what records. It is a hard drive. There's no need to change tapes, etc. CCTV does not form any part of the vehicle checks. And then you mentioned sort of cameras and things earlier. You've given us evidence about that. I do not remember what time I got back to Kirkcaldy Police Office. I went to the writing room initially, and then once everybody came back, we mustered in the canteen. We were told to go to the canteen, but I believe it was Scott Maxwell, although I cannot be certain of that. I forgot to mention that as soon as I got back to the office, as I went in the back door and spoke to Austin Barrett, who is Police Federation representative, Craig asked him to arrange for Federation representation, as he believed we would require. So that was a conversation with PC Austin Barrett, who's a SPF rep. And then it must have been about 10 minutes to 8 when we got back to the office, as I remember Austin saying, I don't start until 8, but he then got involved when he realised what was happening. Everybody who was on shift was in the canteen. Everybody involved in the incident at Hayfield Road. Amanda Given, who's a Federation representative, was there. Austin was there for a time. Various people popped in from time to time. There was a Chief Inspector Conrad Trickett there as well. I cannot be certain of timescales throughout the day or what was said or by whom. Did you remember being in the canteen for the whole day?
Yes.
Did you leave the canteen any time?
Other than to go to the toilet, which is just through one set of doors, no. My thoughts on that are that we were illegally detained, if you like, in the canteen for the day.
Illegally?
Yes.
Yeah. So you felt you were detained in the canteen?
Yes.
And who had told you to stay in the canteen?
I don't know, I just kind of switched off when I went into the canteen and just enjoyed my own company. I can't recall virtually anything that was said or done in the canteen.
What did you do with your vest?
When I first went, when I went into the police station, I went upstairs into the writing room, which is upstairs. Went into the locker room, took my uniform all off because it was contaminated with CS spray. I left it on the locker room floor and put on my civilian clothes. So whilst I was in the canteen, I was in civilian clothes.
Right. We've heard that the officer's equipment was recovered later.
Yeah.
But so did that help and assist you to get over the effects of the CS spray?
Yeah.
And you said there that everyone who was all involved in the incident was in the canteen. Amanda Given was there, Austin Barrett was there, and various people popped in from time to time. Do you remember now who any of the various people were?
Stevie K popped in. Colin Robson popped in. Nicky Shepherd popped in. What they did or said, I can't remember it, but I knew them from working with them that they'd popped in it.
Mm. Do you remember any of the advice they gave you?
No.
Or instructions? No. How were you feeling in the canteen?
Completely and utterly shocked. I was battling with myself because I was all ready for just wrapping it and going home. And I made that known because we were just hanging about like headless chickens. The aftercare in the canteen can only be described as absolutely atrocious.
What would you have liked to have happened that day when you got in the canteen?
Somebody to give some definitive guidance.
What do you mean by definitive guidance? What would you have wanted to know?
It was getting run by folk that had no clue. You need a senior officer to come in and to give clear guidance on where we were going.
The sort of procedures and what should have been happening.
Nobody had experienced anything like that before. Very few people have experienced anything like that again. But for us to have our liberties taken away from them just because of their incompetencies wasn't right.
And if there was a senior officer that you feel should have been responsible for providing that guidance or advice, who do you think that should have been?
Well, it was Park Led,
Perk.
It was Park Led, so I would say somebody for Park.
Yeah. Rather than one of the senior officers in Kirkcaldy Police Office.
I would say.
So, from the moment that Perk became involved, you think they should have had someone in charge?
I couldn't even give you the name of a single person that was working for Park.
Right.
You know, all they had to do was come in and say, introduce themselves, say who they were, and tell you a few things, what your status, what's likely to happen next.
And
It was just a debacle for the time we went back to the police station to the time we left.
did anybody, and as far as you remember now, did anybody come in and give you those clear instructions that
No.
you would have liked?
No.
From any organisation, Police Scotland or Perk? No. And we have heard some evidence that other people were coming in and out of the canteen. It wasn't a sort of sterile area in that sense, that from the back door people can access the canteen. Is that correct?
It's a kind of thoroughfare to the custody area, to the front offices, the reception and that. Folk probably just didn't see the signs.
Right.
Yeah. The building's no fit for purpose, really.
Is it quite old?
It's very old and it's been added over the years and things like that. So.
Okay. You say the next thing I remember is being told that my uniform clothing was being taken in the canteen, and ultimately your clothing was taken, wasn't it, Mr. Paton?
I went back upstairs and got it.
Did you? In the canteen, we were all talking between ourselves. It was about the incident. I can't really be specific about what we were talking about. I was in shock. I remember talking about Nicole and asking how she was. So was this before Nicole came back from the hospital?
No, it can't be because it says that she was brought back by Mark Hayes. And then I say,
Yeah. Well, just look at that paragraph I just read. In the canteen, we were all talking between ourselves. It was about the incident. I cannot really be specific about what we were talking about. I was in shock. I remember talking about Nicole and asking how she was. Do you mean asking Nicole how she was, or asking others how Nicole was?
I think it was just asking others. I mean,
because she's the one officer who wasn't back in the canteen at that time. And you say you can't really be specific about what we were talking about. Had anyone told you at that time, as far as you remember, not to talk about the incident?
no, not that I can remember.
Okay.
It's not to say they didn't, but not that I can remember.
Okay. So during the time you were in the canteen, so the whole day really, did any of your colleagues raise the issue of the fact that Mr. Bio was black?
No.
No. Did anyone raise concerns about the potential for there to be allegations of racism levied against the officers?
No.
You don't remember any of that? Looking then, it says, I remember Mark Hayes popping into the canteen. He had been at the hospital and told me that Nicole was okay. Nicole came to the canteen later. So we've not heard Mark Hayes' name mentioned by you before. Is he another officer at Kirkcaldy Police Office?
He was a good friend of mine, and he I can't remember. He was basically going with us. Why he was down at Kirkcaldy, I don't know. He kind of just had a habit of popping up here, there and everywhere for whatever reason.
Okay.
He came up, took Nicole to the hospital. He had said that she was okay.
Okay. And then I cannot remember if the Federation gave us any advice. I think I was watching the television. I just wanted to be left on my own. Is that a TV in the canteen area?
Yeah.
Do you remember Amanda giving you any advice in the canteen?
No advice, no.
Do you remember speaking to her?
Aye.
What did she say?
What you want at KFC?
Oh, right. Okay. So she was talking about getting you a lunch or something to eat. Did she speak to you at all about your status or statements or any paperwork?
No, I can recall, no.
Okay. And you say, I sat on the settees on my own watching the TV. I was going over things in my head. I think Craig may have been sitting as well. From what I recall, I think the rest of the officers were sitting at a table. It was a bit of strange, really. I cannot recall what happened then. We've heard some evidence that pieces of equipment were on a table in the canteen. Do you remember that?
More than likely there would be.
Right. Do you remember that happening, that pieces of equipment were put on a table?
No.
No.
That was quite common practice.
Was it? And then you say, with regards my baton, I never got my baton back. I seem to recall Derek Connell picking up batons from the scene. I did not use my handcuffs at any point. My CS was still attached to my vest. And that's the CS that you used to spray Mr. Bio. Is that right?
Yeah.
I did not complete any use of force forms or discharge of CS spray forms. Did you know at that time, or did you have a clear understanding of what your obligations were in relation to completion of, let's start with the CS spray forms, use of spray?
So. The procedures changed quite frequently. But either way, it didn't really make much difference because there wasn't a computer in the canteen, and it's a computer-based form.
Did you need access to a computer in order to complete that
You
form?
would do, aye.
And what about the use of force form?
It's also on a computer.
And you didn't complete either of those?
No.
Did you understand at that time that one person could complete a form in relation to the entire incident?
Yes, and I kind of thought that, no, I wouldn't expect Scott Maxwell to do it, but I'd maybe expect either Stevie Kay or maybe even Alan Seath or somebody like that to complete it. I certainly wasn't in a fit state to put my mind to complete any forms.
Right. But you thought maybe an inspector in the office might have been able to do that?
Aye. But then the problem you've got there is that for them to accurately complete a form, they've got to get a recollection of the events from the cops. And we weren't really prepared to give a recollection of events at that stage.
So certainly you don't personally feel you were able to give a recollection at that stage?
No.
But it may have been possible for an inspector to seek out an officer who was able or felt able to give a recollection.
Yeah.
But that wasn't you.
No.
And then when I arrived at the office, I went upstairs and changed out of my uniform as it had been contaminated by CS spray and Pava spray, and that's what you've just told us earlier. I put my CS spray back into my locker along with my airwave radio. I put my uniform in locker room 4 outside my locker. I cannot recall being instructed not to fill in or out any of the normal forms. I cannot tell you what the usual procedure is. It changes week to week. I would rely on my supervisor to remind me. And you then say the Federation rep was in the canteen all day and you can't recall any advice that she gave. And that remains the position today? And can we just go up slightly? And then I remember that Chief Inspector Trickett had been appointed as a sort of welfare go-between coordinator. I can't recall anything he said. He gave me a card. A superintendent with a suntan popped in later in the afternoon, but I cannot recall what he said. I do remember getting advice from one of them. I don't remember who though, to phone home. I did not phone home. I believe it was Amanda, the Fed rep, had advised or encouraged us to do this. Do you remember the name of that superintendent with a suntan?
No. He wouldn't have been a Fife cop.
Not with a suntan.
No, I know most of them, so I don't think it was a Fife cop.
Okay. It wouldn't have been a Pat Campbell.
That's who I think it could possibly have been, but I've not seen a photo of him.
Okay, thank you. And then you were shown a notebook, but there were no entries in your notebook because you didn't put anything in your notebook.
I didn't have my notebook.
Right.
My notebook was upstairs when I took my kit off, upstairs in the changing room. My notebook was up there.
Right.
And I'm obviously down in the canteen, not allowed to leave. So that's why I didn't touch my notebook.
So you were in your civilian clothes,
Yeah.
and your notebooks with your uniform.
Yeah.
And you then say CS spray has never been weighed before, issue in Legacy Fife area. My CS spray is current and valid. Tell me what you mean by about your CS spray being weighed.
As I say, I've never done the weigh-in thing, but I think it's you weigh it at the start of your shift, and then you weigh it either at the end of your shift or maybe the following shift. And if there's a discrepancy in the weight, then that would suggest that you've used it during that period. But that was never the process in Fife. The process in Fife was that you just signed it in and signed it out.
Right, so that wasn't a procedure that was adopted in Fife.
I think the only reason that statement's there is that I'm guessing that the park officers that took my statement were Strathclyde based, and that's maybe the procedure in Strathclyde.
So that probably came from a question they prompted.
But aye.
Thank you. Now, can I ask you a question? You've mentioned status in your answers, and I've asked a lot of officers about status as witness or as suspect. And did you have a clear recollection, or do you have a clear recollection now of being given advice about whether you were being treated as a witness or as a suspect?
No.
And do you remember any of the senior officers talking to you about being treated as a witness?
No.
Do you remember being asked to give a statement as a witness?
I was asked to give a statement, but I don't know if it was as a witness or as a... I don't know what the purpose of the statement was.
Right.
It was two MIC officers.
Right. Do you remember? Well, we've heard that there was a meeting after the events on the 3rd of May, sometime between the 7th and the 13th of May, that two officers, DI Stuart Wilson and DCI Hardy,
That's what it would be.
had met with officers and advised them that their status was that of witness, and would they give statements. Do you remember that?
I remember going into the station. Went into the station because Stephen House was had called a meeting. Whether that was just an excuse to get everybody to go, I don't know. Remember speaking to Alan Seath, who was the station inspector, and he had said that Stuart Hewson and Boy Hardy, what's his first name?
DCI Hardy, I think from memory, Keith.
Keith Hardy. Keith Hardy were in a wee office, but it was nothing more than a tick box exercise, if you like. And thinking about it, it was a tiny wee office. There wasn't nearly enough staff, and it was mid-afternoon. You're not going to start taking a statement under these circumstances. So they knew fine well that they weren't getting a statement at that time. Also, the fact why were wanting statements when it was a park-led inquiry.
And do you feel that wasn't explained to you?
No.
And what was your response to the request about asking you for a statement?
On legal advice not to give a statement at this time.
We've heard from other officers that that was the legal advice they'd received at
Yeah.
the time. And were you consistent with them?
Yeah.
And I'd like to move on now, if I could just have a moment. Thank you. I'm going to move on and ask you about race and some of the complaints, and give you the chance to say your position on those. So if we could look first of all at a complaint in relation to 2009, and it's PS 17860A. And we'll get that on the screen, but you'll have seen some of these papers already. And if we could just start, just scroll down. And what I'll do is I'm going to summarise the sort of background circumstances, Mr. Paton, and then I'm going to ask you to comment on that. So you'll see from some of these references on the first page that this is in relation to a complaint from 2009. And without reading through the document in significant detail, you can take it from me that this 2009 complaint relates to you approaching a woman as she stood in her garden, and in the course of speaking to the complainer in her garden, there was an allegation that you made an inappropriate and offensive comment regarding an individual known to her, namely that he would learn his lesson whilst in jail if he became someone's wife. And it was alleged that you commented, he'll maybe learn his lesson, and never mind, if he's made into somebody's wife, he'll maybe learn his lesson. And that comment was overheard by the complainer and another witness, and that resulted in this formal complaint being made that you see on the screen. And you denied making that statement, and then the investigating officer considered the matter, found the complainer to be a very reasonable individual who'd been genuinely upset by the comments with no agenda against the police. And when you interviewed, and I'm quoting, your attitude was poor, and you were dismissive of that complaint and somewhat petulant. And the investigating officer stated that the complainer and the other witness have, in my opinion, provided the more credible narrative of events, and the matter was reported to the Chief Superintendent, who was of the view that there was insufficient evidence to substantiate the allegation, although he was of the opinion that a remark may have been made and you were given corrective advice. So that's my summary of these papers without having to go through them in a lot of detail for you. Would you like to explain the circumstances of this?
Yes. In relation to the complaints made against me, I continued to deny any wrongdoing. Not only did I deny the spurious complaints, but so did the other officers that were with me on each of the occasions. While I maintain my denial, I can advise, however, that any correct advice given was always taken on board. In relation to this specific complaint, no such incivility took place at all. My colleague, who was that day, also denied any such incivility. The officer dealing with this complaint did not respect officers below him. He was nothing far short of a bully and didn't like the fact that I stood up to him, and he was predisposed to disbelief myself.
Are you reading from something
Yes.
there, Mr. Paton?
Yes.
And would you mind holding that up so I can have a look at it? It's not your inquiry statement, is it?
It's a statement that I believe you've got already.
A statement. Is this the supplementary statement that have been sent today?
Yes.
Does it say at the top, this is a supplementary statement of retired officer Alan Paton?
Yes.
Right. So just so that the chair knows, because I'm not sure he'll have a copy of this yet, this is a 2-page document. You've handed it in, or your lawyers have handed it to us today, and do you wish to rely on this supplementary statement?
Yes.
As supplementary to the inquiry statement that you gave and we referred you to earlier?
Yes.
Thank you. And I'll be able to give a copy of that to the chair for him to consider. Thank you. So that's what you've been reading from.
Yeah.
And in addition to, the chair will be able to read all of this document. In addition to what you've written here, is there anything else you'd like to say about this 2009 complaint on top of what you've already read out?
No.
And there was mention in my summary of the circumstances that there was corrective advice given. Can you tell us what the corrective advice was and how it was given?
I can't recall.
You don't remember. How is corrective advice normally given?
I can't recall.
All right. Do you remember how long after the complaint came in that you were given the corrective advice?
No.
And you mentioned the investigating officer or the more senior officer. Do you remember who that was?
Yes.
Do you want to say what the person's name was? Was he an inspector or was he more senior than that?
He was an inspector. He was a bully.
Right,
He liked to pick on people with younger service than him.
right. And he was trying to bully you.
Yes.
And you've said that you...
And he didn't like the fact that I stood up for myself against him.
Right. How did you stand up for yourself?
Basically told him that there was nothing at all in the complaint. And that's probably why I've come across as a perpetuant attitude.
Yeah. And you've said that you did take on board any corrective advice
Yeah.
that you received. Would it have been the same officer that gave you the corrective advice, or would that have been a separate officer?
I can't recall.
Okay.
I don't know.
And so you've said you took it on board. How did you adapt your behaviour in light of that corrective advice?
I didn't. I just went a wee bit about my business as I normally do,
Right.
dealing with thousands warrants and never getting a complaint.
Thank you. And then can we move on to a second complaint that I want to ask you about from 2010, the following year. So this is PS 13586A. And again, these papers you will have seen and had a chance to look at, but for today's purposes, I'll summarise this for you and then ask you some questions. So this is a complaint from 2010. And you, accompanied by another officer, attended a home address to execute an apprehension warrant. The first complainer was an Asian woman who answered the door. She did not speak fluent English and did not understand what was happening, so telephoned the second complainer, an Asian man who was at work. She asked you to speak to the second complainer on the telephone, and you refused to do so. The complaint, which was classed as an irregularity in procedure, was upheld. During the investigative process, PC Paton stated that he had no reason to speak to the second complainer and did not believe your actions were inappropriate or unprofessional. And the superintendent who dealt with this expressed concern at your poor communication skills and I'm quoting, your clear lack of understanding of cultural issues in dealing with Muslim women and a basic respect for diversity-related matters. And again, corrective advice was provided. So again, would you like to explain the circumstances of this?
Yes.
And again, are you referring to your supplementary
Yes.
statement?
As with my colleague that day, we were of the belief fully understood English, and the reason we had attended at the locus, we presented a lawful warrant. Now, there had been previous officers who had attended to execute the warrant without success, and none of them had used or had noted the opinion that an interpreter was necessary or required. There is a running log with warrants, so it would have been clearly stated on it. I had no idea who was on the telephone, and I had no legal requirement to speak to them. Indeed, if I had, it may have hampered my actions in executing the warrant. I did, however, reflect on the advice I had been given by my line manager. I would also like to point out that I have arranged interpreters on several occasions during the course of my time as an officer, and would have been more than happy to do so on this occasion should I have believed it was required. I fully explained my position to management, where they considered my actions were reasonable or not. I did nothing wrong in this case whatsoever.
Thank you. And can I just question you about a few things here? You mentioned your colleague. Who was that?
I believe it was Danny Gibson.
Right. And you say if you'd spoken to the person on the phone, that may have hampered any action you took. What do you mean?
Well, you don't know who's on the other end of the phone. Mm-hmm. Is you speaking to the person on the phone a delaying tactic to allow somebody to nip out the back door?
I see.
For the warrant, you know, is it the subject of the warrant, and you're giving them a heads up that there's a warrant and he goes to ground?
I see.
If a warrant's for a named person, you only have to give that information to the named person.
And that's the proper procedure.
That's the proper procedure.
And then you talk about your line manager. Who was your line manager?
I can't recall.
No. Right. And you've said there were you took the view no interpreter was necessary or required.
No. It wouldn't have been any effort whatsoever for me to get an interpreter. It's a case of dialing it up on your handset, handing the phone to her, and finding out what language she spoke first of all, handing the phone to her. It would have taken a couple of minutes. I would have done it if it was required, but it was not required. The only reason that this came to complaint, and I think you'll notice that it's not the actual female that's made the complaint, it's the male that's made the complaint.
That was your understanding of the
That was the case.
Right.
It was the male on the other end of the phone that made the complaint.
Right. I was going to ask you how you would go about arranging an interpreter in that situation, where you've turned up and someone at the door doesn't appear to speak good English. You've said you would dial your handset. Is that like a number on your radio?
Just on your airwave terminal. You've got a number to phone. Find out what language it is that they speak, first of all.
And how do you find out what language they're speaking?
You had most people can say what language they speak, even if they didn't understand English. But you also had a laminated card,
right,
and it had in English what language do you speak, and then alongside it was maybe Urdu, or what language you speak alongside it, Polish, or what, and you just point to it.
Right. And you said you would then be able to get an interpreter. How easy was it to get an interpreter in those circumstances?
For the majority of languages, instant.
All right.
I can probably help.
No, you're not giving evidence under oath.
Right,
sorry.
okay,
Thank you for the offer. But no, we'll just stick with you, Mr. Paton,
Right.
if that's okay. We can find out more information about this in due course. So that's how you would have gone about getting an interpreter. But you had concerns about the genuineness of the person saying they couldn't, or they indicating they couldn't speak fluent English. What was causing you to have those concerns?
Because she was understanding.
How did you know that?
Because she was replying back to things that we were putting to her.
And you also mentioned previous references to, you had a warrant, and there was some other reference to no interpreter being required.
Yep.
Tell us about that.
Well, the warrants used to be owned by normally your van crew. So normal myself, so I've got a lot of experience executing warrants. However, they kind of changed, and they would be allocated to a team. And so anybody could actually go in and enforce a warrant. And there's a log attached to them. And you would just update the log with anything that was pertinent. So attended on the set date, spoke to the female within, did not understand English, interpreter required for next attendance or something like that. And there was nothing like that.
But that information would normally be available to you if an interpreter was required.
Yeah.
You could check that before you attend. I'm grateful to Malerne Jr. She's just checked the paperwork, Mr. Paton, and it would appear it wasn't Daniel Gibson that you were with, it was a PC. I don't have the first name, no. We don't know the first name.
He's retired now.
Right. So it may have been a different officer, not Daniel Gibson. Yes.
It was redacted in the copy that I got, so I was just getting you guessing.
All right. No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you. And you were given corrective advice, again in relation to this complaint. What advice were you given?
Don't know.
Do you remember who gave it to you?
No.
And what did you do? Again, you've said that you responded to any corrective advice. What did you do in relation to that advice? Did you adapt your behaviour in any way?
Not particularly, because I was using the interpreter facilities anyhow. So I didn't really have to adapt my my working practices in any way. A vast majority of the warrants that I dealt with in Kirkcaldy were for Polish and Eastern European, so I was using the interpreter services all the time.
And when you say all the time, how often were you using those services?
Maybe 3 times a week, something like that. And they worked well.
Oh, good. Can I then move on to another complaint in 2011? Now, we've got a number of different documents about this complaint. For today's purposes, what I'll do again is just summarise the circumstances and then ask you some questions. But if you do want to look at any of the papers, you're very welcome to do so. So 2011, you had a neighbour who made a series of 3 formal complaints against you, and that was noted in your records. The first was to the effect that when off duty, you'd approached her and shouted, "You're a compulsive liar, an attention seeker, fucking mad." And that complaint was found to be unsubstantiated, but resulted in corrective advice. The second complaint was that she then alleged that you would smile, stare, grin and gesticulate at her in order to intimidate her. The complaint again was found to be unsubstantiated because there was no corroborating evidence. But you were reminded of the expected standards of behaviour for serving police officers, and that a failure to maintain those standards could lead to misconduct proceedings. And then the third complaint was made to the effect that you again had approached her and called her an ugly sumo. And this resulted in you being charged with a contravention of Section 39 of the Criminal Justice and Licensing Scotland Act 2010. And the case was marked no proceedings on the ground of triviality, and the matter was then considered for misconduct proceedings. And the Chief Inspector who considered these complaints, there were clear grounds for a case of misconduct, and PC Paton's actions had, and I quote, brought the force into disrepute. Had he taken cognizance of management advice initially, he would not have found himself in this position. And on this occasion, a formal warning was given. Again, would you like to explain the background to this?
Yes. Before I say anything, this complaint was completely and utterly handled wrongly by the police. I'm aware a former neighbour, her name was, made a malicious complaints about me, This follows an orchestrated campaign by her against my wife and children. She had significant mental health problems. I approached the Scottish Police Federation for assistance and advice regarding an interdict, and I spoke to senior management about my concerns on several occasions, particularly around protection. Following this, and after several requests by myself to make a complaint against her and refused, I made an official complaint to the police about her actions as a member of the public. I was subsequently pressurised by a now retired inspector to withdraw it. There were numerous witnesses, independent witnesses who could have corroborated my complaints. One was even discouraged from giving evidence by a separate senior officer. I also understood or understand she has made subsequent malicious complaints of a sensitive nature against other people, including and other police officers, and all of them were also unfounded. I believe this complaint to have been seriously mishandled by police.
You've obviously read again from the supplementary statement, which we'll provide a copy of to the chair and the assessors. Do you wish to provide us with the names of any of these retired inspector, senior officers, or anyone else?
Yes.
Do you wish to tell us who the retired inspector was?
The retired inspector that told me to withdraw the complaint.
Right.
The retired inspector who I basically voiced my concerns to, looking for help, was, and the senior, she was a sergeant for my team that I made aware of the neighbour's actions was.
Thank you. And were they based in Fife at that
Yes.
time? But your feeling is that the situation was mishandled by the police.
100%.
But you were given a formal warning. Can you explain to me what's the difference between corrective advice and a formal warning?
I don't know.
Do you remember being given a formal warning?
No.
And in relation to the comments by the Chief Inspector that you had brought the force into disrepute, and if you'd taken cognizance of management advice initially, you wouldn't have found yourself in this position. Do you have any comment to make about that comment?
Reverse it. If they had taken cognizance of what I was reporting, we wouldn't have found ourselves in this position. They were, I believe the charge was also stalking, which was a very new piece of legislation, which the force didn't want to get wrong. It's the usual story that the police want to protect their image above the thoughts of the officers, and they'll always take the side of the civilian complainer.
Right. And you've mentioned that you sought advice from the Scottish Police Federation.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that? How did you make contact with them, and what advice did you seek?
I phoned them asking for to discuss the possibilities of an interdict. Thankfully, she has now moved. My worry is that this getting brought up at the inquiry and getting made public is going to kick it all back up again, but I've nothing I can do about that.
Thank you. Can I ask you now finally about a statement from your grandfather? Perk 00473 and page 2. Just at the top of page 2. Well, actually, can we go back to page 1 and we'll just see what you've said, what's said here. So you can see that it's a statement dated the 13th of January 2016. So it's the year after the events that I've been asking you about. At 11:15 at his home address, taken by Investigating Officer Victoria Karen, and it was in the presence of Solicitor Amar Anwar. And if we can just go down that page, please. And he's given a statement to Perk about his grandson, which was yourself, Alan Paton. And he talks about meeting you once in the supermarket and then speaking to Amar Anwar at the end of August 2015. And he said it was a Morrison's supermarket in the bakery. And he does say there, I seen him first, so I asked him how he was. I can't remember the conversation exactly. My memory isn't the best. Can I ask you about your grandfather's memory at this time? So at the time he's giving this statement, could you tell the chair what you remember about his memory at this time?
I think dementia was set in. Certainly that was what I was getting told by other members of the family, was that he was acting erratically. They were concerned about him going missing, and things like that. When my gran died, my granddad went downhill quickly. And as I say, I don't know if he was officially diagnosed with dementia, but that was certainly the opinion.
When did your gran die?
I can't remember.
Was it prior to May 2015?
Yeah.
How much contact did you have with your grandfather?
I used to have quite a lot.
Right. Around about this time, January 2016?
Not that much.
Right. Can I move on to the next page of this statement? And it says you weren't in uniform. I remember Alan saying to me that he was a total racist and hated all blacks. And so he goes straight into this. There's not really much context given here. First of all, do you remember saying that to your grandfather?
No such conversation took place. At no time have I, or indeed would I, state that I have a hatred towards anybody. Anybody suggesting I made such a comment as an ulterior motive, and the fact that the solicitor is Amar Anwar kind of suggests that that's the case.
Okay. So again, I see you reading out from your supplementary statement.
Yes.
And you've said that anyone saying this about you has an ulterior motive.
Yes.
Can you explain what the ulterior motive would be that your grandfather would have?
It's to do with other members of my family, and I'm just want to leave it at that.
All right. So there's other family dynamics in the background, issues that are going on.
Yes.
And when you say that might be an ulterior motive, was your grandfather on the side of the other members of the family?
Yes.
Not on you?
I'm very much influenced.
Very much influenced by other members of the family?
Yes.
And so you deny ever saying that to your grandfather?
It doesn't even make sense.
Right. And then you've also mentioned Mr. Amar Anwar.
Yeah.
And obviously he was present when this was given.
Funny that, eh?
And do you have some concerns about that as
Yes.
well? Yeah. Do you want to explain to the chair what your
I don't think it
concerns
needs explaining.
are? All right. So Is there anything else that you feel you'd like to say about this statement?
No.
No. So the chair should have a read at your supplementary statement and consider what you've already said.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, I know earlier in your evidence you talked about the performance and development review papers, and you've touched on some good examples of using interpreters and things like this. My understanding is that might be touched on later by your own QC.
Yes.
But I'd like to ask you some other questions about race, general questions, if you don't mind, before I finish. Can I talk about your perception of events when you arrived at Hayfield Road? We've heard that Mr. Biles 5'10" and 12 stone 10. You arrive with PC Walker, who's 25 stone. You're 17 stones at the time, and you're both 6'4". So Mr. Bile was shorter and lighter than both of you.
Yeah.
He doesn't have a knife visible. And you're obviously both there in your full uniform, with your equipment, with a big transit van, with flashing lights. And you're trained, you're experienced officers. Can I ask, what were your concerns when you arrived at the time?
That he did still have a knife, and that he was going to go on to use it again, as he had done a few minutes beforehand.
Arriving as you did, how realistic do you feel those concerns were at the time?
Very, very realistic.
Have you been involved with previous incidents which have gone wrong and officers have been injured or threatened?
Yes.
Do you want to tell me about any of those knife incidents?
No knife incidents.
Right.
Dumbbells.
Right.
Bar for dumbbells.
Right. Have you been involved with any knife incidents where things have gone wrong and officers have been
More
injured?
than likely I have. Worked in the two busiest towns in Fife. So more than likely I have, but I can't recall any.
Right. And have you, prior to May 2015, the 3rd of May, had you used your CS spray at knife incidents before?
Can't be specific, but probably.
Do you remember any incidents? Had
No.
you ever used your baton before?
Once in my service, and it was ineffective.
Right. And when was that?
It was a guy that ended up fighting with my colleague. I was quite young in service. He was coked out his head. I struck him to the legs. Didn't bring him to the ground. He actually thanked me the next day for doing it.
You say young in service. You've told us earlier you had 14 years service by May 2015. How young in service were you?
Well, it was my tutor corp that I was with, so it could have been as early as sort of 6 months service.
So you were a probationer
Could
in
have
that?
been, yeah.
And apart from when you were a probationer, had you ever used your baton?
That was my baton.
Yes, had you ever used it apart from when you were a probationer, and you've told us? Any other occasions?
Nah.
Had
Just to break into things.
Had you ever used your spray in a knife incident before the 3rd of May 2015?
Can't recall.
And if Mr. Bio had been white when you arrived, it was a white man that you saw there with no knife, would you still have considered the need to issue immediate commands and then use your spray?
100%.
Looking back now, you don't think you could have given him more time or spoken to him? Or
No, I would have done nothing different.
right. And had you attended incidents prior to the 3rd of May 2015 where someone was suffering from a mental health crisis or under the influence of drink or drugs? Had you used your communication skills with that person?
Every other day of my working life.
Right. But not on this occasion?
It wasn't the time or the place.
And the distinction for this event was what? Why is it different on this occasion?
Because it was corroborated that he was using the knife. He was causing, but he was potentially causing harm to members of the public and their cars. That, from my first sightings of him, I formed the opinion that he was on drugs, that he had the physical capability to continue causing damage. Yeah.
And that's what was the difference
That was
for
the
you?
difference.
Looking back now, what role, if any, do you think his race played in the way you decided how to handle this situation?
Nothing whatsoever.
What difference did his race make, if any, about the choices that you made, tactical choices?
Nothing whatsoever.
Looking back now, do you think he appeared to you to be a greater potential threat because he was black?
No, because you get muscly, big guys out their face on drugs with knives that are white.
If he'd been white, would you have viewed him as someone potentially less violent or less likely to resist?
No.
Or more compliant?
No.
If he'd been white, would you have been willing to try speaking to him, communicating?
I did try and speak to him.
Is that the commands that we've talked about
Yeah.
earlier? What I'm thinking is, if he had been white, would you have been more inclined to ask him if there was a problem, or how was he, or had he got any sharp implements?
No. I was taking control of the situation.
Right.
I wasn't there to have a conversation with him.
Okay. And can I ask you about training? You'll know that I've asked a lot of officers about their training, and I've asked them about equality and diversity training that they'd had. And many have given evidence about getting training at Tully Allen. Is that something that you had?
21 years ago. I believe I had it during my my times up at Tully Allen. I also had a diversity training day up at Fife headquarters, probably around about 2014 or something like that. You'd have to check my scope records, but yeah, that's the two sort of training packages I've had.
And the training that you had the year before, May 2015, do you remember if you were taught anything about unconscious bias?
What is unconscious bias?
Were you asked any questions about maybe making assumptions about people because of the colour of their skin? You're not even really aware of those assumptions, and you're treating people in a certain way, just unconsciously?
No.
Were you asked about that?
No, not that I recall.
Do you remember being asked to identify any biases that you yourself have?
Can't remember anything about any of the training.
No. So when you came out of your training course in 2014, were there any learning points that you did take on board that you then used and adapted your own day-to-day working practices?
Yeah.
What were they?
No necessarily towards black people, but for example, being towards like the travelling fraternity. Travelling fraternity have a general sort of dislike of the police, and it was trying to you go into a camp, who's best to speak to? You know, there's generally a top man. Speak to them. Just things like that I wasn't aware of before. I actually put that into practice, and again I think that's in one of my PDRs that you've got.
I'm sure that this can be elaborated on by your own QC. Do you want to tell us about that yourself now?
It was a road accident involving members of the travelling fraternity, and I communicated with, I think it was a double fatal. I communicated with the family members and got praise for it.
And did you use the training that you'd got in 2014 to help you deal with that situation?
Yeah.
And then, did they teach you, about bias at all in 2014, and maybe how to guard against that? To avoid treating people and making assumptions which weren't correct?
I'm sure it did, but I can't really recall any specifics.
Okay. Do you make any assumptions, or in 2015 did you make any assumptions?
No, I treat everybody the same.
And in relation to Mr. Bio, did you make any assumptions about him because he was black?
No, not at all.
Had you ever come across any examples of discriminatory behaviour in Kirkcaldy Police Office by 2015?
No.
Had you ever heard any racist jokes or comments
No.
By your colleagues?
Nope.
So we have inquiry statements that people have provided to the chair, as you have provided one to the chair. One of the chief inspectors has given a statement describing having at some time experienced inappropriate racist jokes. Had you ever heard any such jokes in your career in Kirkcaldy?
Racist jokes by me?
No, not by you, no.
No.
Just that he was aware of that in Kirkcaldy in advance of May 2015.
No.
You're not aware of that. If you had come across any behaviour of that type in your work and your dealings with other colleagues in 2015, how would you have responded to that?
What would you say to them?
What would you have said?
It's not appropriate.
And any of the colleagues that were with you on the 3rd of May 2015 exhibited any behaviour of that sort to you?
The incident on the 3rd of May 2015 was not in the slightest bit racist. There was nothing done, nothing said, either at the locus, back at the canteen, in the days that followed, in the weeks that followed, in the months that followed. There was nothing at all racially motivated or racially said with racial connotations.
So even back in the canteen, nothing discussed about
No,
race?
Nothing at all.
In 2015, were you aware of concerns about, public concerns about the use of force by police officers, particularly against black men?
No.
Were you not aware of anything of that sort from the news or from internet?
No, I didn't follow the news.
Right. Were you aware of any concerns being discussed within Police Scotland at that time?
No.
Were you aware of any high-profile cases in other parts of the UK
No.
or abroad regarding restraint of
No.
black men?
I don't follow the news.
You've not even heard of George Floyd?
That's America.
Yes. Were you aware of any?
I was aware of the George Floyd situation, yeah.
Aware of George Floyd in America?
Yeah.
Nothing in England?
No.
Nothing in other parts of the UK?
No.
How confident now, looking back, how confident were you in the training that you'd received? You've made comments earlier today about the training in relation to handling an incident of this sort. How confident were you in the training that you'd had on equality and diversity, matters relating to race?
I think it probably could be improved, if I'm being honest. Maybe every 2 years or something like that would be handy.
So maybe more
done for the right purposes and for the right reasons. I think it probably could do more, because I've heard some people that's given evidence saying that their last input was when they were up at Tilly Allen. Well, that's not really acceptable in my opinion. And everybody likes a wee day out, of course.
So maybe more regular training.
But no rammed in your throat. No every year. Something like every 2 years would be more than enough, I think.
Yeah. Because for an officer like yourself and for other officers, you'd had 14 years service, and you're saying you had training in Tully Allen, and then the year before you had a day.
But to be honest, most of your learning's done on the job.
Right. And that's where you can experience real life. Yeah. Can I ask you about your awareness of the black community in Kirkcaldy round about May 2015? Did you have a strong awareness of the black community?
I'm aware there were black individuals, but there's no really a big black community in Kirkcaldy. Kirkcaldy is a very diverse town now, but black people don't really form that a big part of it.
Okay. So had you had much contact with black people as witnesses, as suspects, or as victims of crime?
I didn't like the specific questions regarding black people.
All right.
I prefer the specific questions regarding people of the
Black and minority ethnic?
Minority ethnic.
Yeah, all right.
In which case I did have a lot of dealings with it. I was a community officer on 2 occasions, both in the Temple Hall area of Kirkcaldy, which has its own antisocial issues. Also covers, I think Scott Maxwell mentioned to you, the main mosque is in Temple Hall in the north of Kirkcaldy. So although I wasn't the mosque liaison officer, I attended on most of the occasions that Scott Maxwell or others attended. Also, part of the duties on the van was going around the areas of concern, like mosques, like warehouses full of whiskey. It's all to do with terrorist stuff and things like that. The concern for obviously the checks on the mosques was that they were getting vandalised and graffitied, etc., on the back of things like the Lee Rigby incident. And whilst I was doing them, I was speaking with the mans and people. I worked in cash and carries, which was predominantly people from the Asian minority. I've worked with Chinese people. I've worked with all sorts. So I've had a lot of contact with non-white people. I've not had a great deal, apart from one officer that I worked with that was black.
Who was that one officer?
Paul Castledine, his name was.
Where was he based?
I worked with him when we were at Glenrothes.
Right. You mentioned you were a community officer on 2 occasions.
Yeah.
When was that in relation to May 2015? Was it before?
Before. A couple of years before.
A couple of years before. And how long did you do that?
3 years or so.
And in terms of involvement with the...
And you're doing things like going out to schools where there's black children and things like that, you know.
So how, when you were a community officer, how regular was your contact with the BAME community?
Well, I held monthly meetings, community engagement meetings, which anybody was entitled to come along to, and we did have some that came along. Also, we would get invited to events. One that springs to mind is that it's in the local park, in the Beveridge Park. It's called the Peace Garden, and it was a coming together of Muslims, Eastern Europeans, Chinese, Indians. It was a coming together of everybody, and I attended there in the capacity as a police officer, just integrated with them all. So I've done a fair bit. In comparison to response cops, you know, you do quite a lot as a community officer.
Yeah. And having done that role, you must be aware of stereotypes that are sometimes applied to people in that community. Can you give us some examples of the stereotypes you're aware of?
Well, as I say, there's no a big black community in Kirkcaldy, but I could say stereotypes as that just youths in general, you know, youths are a gang, youths are causing trouble, youths are the ones that are causing the damage and things like that, which, to be honest with you, 9 times out of 10, it's not the youths,
Right.
or it's one youth that's you've just got to kind of work with.
Were you aware that sometimes black men may be perceived as more likely to resist, be more violent, have superhuman strength or size?
No, I wasn't there, no.
No. Did you ever have any assumptions along those lines? Now, in your statement, which we've gone through in detail, you described Mr. Bio as being a large black male,
Yeah.
although he was lighter than you and PC Walker and smaller. What was it about him that made you describe him as large?
Because he was large. He was black, and he was a male.
When you say he was large, what is it you mean by that?
His physique, his muscles, his neck muscles, his biceps, his chest.
So it was his musculature.
He was a steroid user, so he was pumped up.
Right. Can I ask you one question about, you've described Mr. Bio walking towards you with his palms out and you didn't see a knife, and you've talked about being in fear of your life for that time. Have you ever felt fear for your life on any other knife calls where you see that the suspect didn't have a knife in his hands?
Oh,
No.
no.
So what made this situation different?
Just that I had no control. I had no control at all. And I was then, because I'd been incapacitated, because I have no option but to crouch down in a vulnerable position, I just thought, my time's come.
So it was at the point you were incapacitated by the spray that you felt that level of fear.
Yeah.
Prior to that, how were you feeling?
The adrenaline's gone. I wouldn't say I was in fear of my life prior to that. Obviously, got to have your wits about you because it could go pear-shaped. But as I say, I felt confident enough to seize the opportunity to try and get control of the situation before it got out of control, before he got to a knife, before he got to another member of the public, before he ran off where we didn't know where he was. If he had had a knife, I wouldn't have been out in that van, but I seized the opportunity.
Right. So it was about seizing the opportunity.
Yeah.
Could you just give me one moment, please? Thank you very much, Mr. Paton. That concludes my examination.
Thank you. Right, we'll take a 10-minute break at this point. Yes, when you're ready, Ms. Vargas. Mr. Paton, could you help me with one thing? Before you discharged your CS spray, did you consider the direction and the strength of the wind?
No, but I should have.
Could you expand on that?
I didn't have many options available to me, left open to me. So I thought I might be able to spray. And when you're spraying, you spray in short bursts till you get a feel of where the spray is going to go. So if I sprayed and it ended up down there, I would adjust my aim to the side. But I wasn't able to do that because the wind was so strong. So I basically sprayed it out, some hit his face, it about turned, came back, hit me in the face.
Thank you. Ms. McConaughey, do you have an application?
I do.
Yes. I think some of it at least has been flagged up already by Ms. Graham. Are there other issues in addition to that?
There are one or two, yes.
Right. Well, perhaps you could come up and just briefly outline to me what the areas are, and then I can deal with the application.
I don't know if it's appropriate for Mr. Paton to remain, or it might be better if you like.
Yes, very well. Mr. Paton, I'm going to ask you to leave the room while I hear from Mr. McConaughey. Yes.
Yeah, so one of the issues that I think has occurred in the course of Mr. Paton's evidence is the tendency to, as it were, conflate information that he knows now with information that he had back on the 3rd of May 2015. And from the point of view of clarification, I was hoping to go over with him the actual state of his knowledge as he was getting to the incident on the 3rd of May 2015 from the airwaves transmissions that are within the content of this document. I also wanted to explore in just perhaps the tiniest amount of detail the position with regards to the transmission from Acting Sergeant Maxwell and where on the video footage that we have the vehicle, and more particularly Mr. Paton, was likely to be if the blue dots are accurate in terms of where he was when that transmission was taking place, and why it might be he perhaps did not certainly either hear it all or wasn't paying attention to it all. I also want to explore with him, he mentioned one officer, Paul Castledine, who has in fact provided a statement which has been sent to the inquiry, along with another officer, both officers with whom he worked, who were non-white officers, and his relationship with them. I also want to briefly discuss one of the complaints, the 2010 warrant complaint, and his relationship with his grandfather and the circumstances surrounding that meeting, and perhaps why the idea that he would, as it were, confide in his grandfather to that extent don't really make much sense. Those are the areas. One other thing, Lord, he mentioned in evidence that his CS spray was his, as it were, weapon of choice before his baton. He wasn't asked why that was, and I was going to ask him why that was.
Yes, very well. I shall allow you to cover these areas.
I understand that Mr. Paton may have taken the opportunity to use the facilities.
Right,
So
okay.
you're just being
Right. Mr. McConaughey, I don't think you mentioned the issue that had been flagged up for you, but are you intending to look at some of the positive?
I was taking that as read.
I take that
sir.
as read. All right, thank you. Would you like to come to the seat then? Yes. Now, Mr. Paton, Mr. McConaughey has some questions for you.
Mr. Paton, have you found it difficult to give evidence purely in relation to what your knowledge was as at the 3rd of May 2015, without taking into account a whole raft of information that you've received since that date, including listening to this inquiry?
Yes.
Can I refer you to the timeline, if you have that, please? And this is with a view to trying to identify what information you actually had as you were attending that scene. If you look at page 1, there's a call at 7:16:32, or an airwave transmission at 7:16:32.
Yeah.
From control, which talks about a disturbance ongoing, male armed with a knife, African-looking male, chasing someone, maybe carrying a knife, and then there's a description given.
Yeah.
At that point in time, were you, in fact, as it were, attending another call, supposedly?
Yes.
And when you heard that, what did you do?
We were about halfway towards the call that had been sent. It was an alarm call. It was nothing too pressing. But about turned the van, done a U-turn and then headed in the direction of this knife call.
Now, if we go on to page 2, at 7:17:04, there's another transmission saying yeah, and then something that's not picked up. That's another grade 1 call coming in for the Victoria Road, Kirkcaldy. Male armed with a knife, male in possession of a large knife, a black male wearing white t-shirt and jacket, walking along the street with a large knife in his right hand, about a 9-inch blade. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, without going into detail, am I right in thinking that because of your local knowledge, you recognise there was potentially an issue here in the sense of one of the locus or one of the loci was not correct?
Yes, it's a mistake that's quite often made.
And we can see, I don't need to go through it, but we can see in the course of the transmissions that you raised that with control.
Yeah.
And it's you who effectively eventually identifies, when Gallagher's pub's mentioned, exactly where the locus is.
Yeah.
And then, if you go on to page 3 for me, please. At 7:19:54, we see a transmission from yourself saying, Roger, that's us approaching locus. Yes?
Yes.
And then there's another airwave transmission from control. That's another call saying he was seen walking in the direction of the hospital in the middle of the road.
Yes.
So those 3, as it were, transmissions are the information you have at the time about the man in the middle of the road with a knife, on one view from the first of these transmissions, chasing someone.
Yeah.
You told counsel to the inquiry that you had attended knife incidents before.
Yes.
This one you have assessed and you've given your explanation for it. This one was different.
Yes.
In relation to incidents that you have attended before, Have you attended incidents which involved somebody in possession of a knife?
Yeah.
And on that occasion, or those occasions, what did you do?
Talked them down.
Was there in particular an incident which is referred to in one of your PDRs where someone was in possession of a knife and was threatening to do harm to themselves?
That was most often the case of knife calls, was people threatening to do harm to themselves. And there was one particular occasion that I'm aware of. I think it was at the hospital. Boy had gone up onto the roof of the hospital with a knife, and I was at the hospital. Something tells me that there wasn't any senior officers on duty for whatever reason that day, so I sort of took control and command of the incident, and ultimately was able to build a rapport with him and talk him down for the roof.
Was that a situation where you considered the communication, perhaps of the kind that Senior Counsel to the Inquiry has suggested to you, was more appropriate than the situation you found yourself in with Mr. Bayou?
Oh, it was 100% more appropriate.
You mentioned in the course of the questions you were being asked about race and about your involvement with either black officers or indeed people who were committing crime. You mentioned somebody called Paul Castledine.
Yeah.
How did you know him?
I worked in Glenrothes. Paul was on the same shift as me at Glenrothes. I think I probably had about maybe 3 years service or something like that. Paul had, God knows how much, but he was an experienced officer, and I worked primarily on the van with him because we couldn't fit into cars.
Because he was
quite a big chap as well.
All right. And am I right in saying he was the chairman of the Black Police Officers Association?
Yeah, he was, aye.
And are you also aware that he has provided a statement which has been submitted to the inquiry?
Yes.
How did you get on with him?
A legend.
He was?
Yeah.
Did you also serve with an officer called Alan MacDonald?
Alan MacDonald, yeah. I served with him when I first moved to Kirkcaldy. I was on the same team as him there.
And do you recall what his ethnicity was?
I believe his father was white Scottish, and I believe his mother was from Sri Lanka. And Alan's actual appearance, Alan has a sort of an Asian appearance.
And where did you serve with him?
Kirkcaldy.
And for how long?
Maybe 4 years.
And how did you go on with him?
Brilliant, aye. Both inside work and outside work.
And again, to your knowledge, did he submit a statement supportive of you to the inquiry?
Yeah.
You mentioned an incident to Senior Counsel to the inquiry about a situation, a road traffic accident involving the travelling community.
Yeah.
And can you recall what happened in relation to that? From
what I recall, it was a mother and son who had been at an Asda's on the sort of outskirts of Kirkcaldy and had crossed a dual carriageway going back towards their home address, knocked over and killed. And they lived in the immediate vicinity, and the drums started beating very quickly, and it just turned into chaos, you know. The families all going to Locus, and it was just pandemonium. And what I managed to sort of do was arrange for them to all go back to this one address. I wasn't the liaison officer, but as one hadn't been appointed, but until there was one appointed, I was the liaison officer for that.
You mean the family liaison officer?
Aye, family liaison officer for that. It was just really taking control and showing a bit sort of empathy and, you know, just...
Well, was it something that required communication skills?
Yeah, definitely.
Were you able, on that occasion, to assist all parties with regards to
Yeah.
that? I wonder, I don't know if it's how easy or how difficult it is, if we can look at the bit of footage of the vehicle that you were in arriving at the scene. And if what I would want you to do when we look at this is to observe the vehicle and also listen to the transmission from Acting Sergeant Maxwell at the same time if you can. So this is the period just when the vehicle is arriving. So it is on page 3 and probably starting, let's say, around 7:20, or maybe where you are actually would do fine.
Sergeant Maxwell, is it not the inspector?
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon, it is Inspector
Yes,
Stewart. Yes,
yes.
you're right. You're right.
Inspector Stewart, area control room to the set attending. I'm monitoring this obviously from an ARV perspective. If you get sightings of the male, you need to make an initial assessment yourself and feedback
Pause
straight
there,
away.
please. We're in the middle of that transmission, I think, just at that point. We're at 7:20:27 on the clock. And albeit it's a reconstruction at the top left-hand corner of the screen, do we see at that point that it appears, if that reconstruction is accurate, that both yourself and what would be Constable Walker have exited the vehicle before that transmission's complete?
Definitely, I think, although it's grainy on the main CCTV screen below that, you can actually see movement as well.
Of you leaving the vehicle?
Yeah.
And you left first?
Yes.
Given the circumstances of you arriving at the scene, what you were, presumably you had seen Mr. Bayou by this point?
Yes.
And what you were dealing with, do you think you either have any recollection of hearing that transmission or can understand perhaps why you didn't hear that transmission?
I don't have any recollection of that transmission. Whether it was because of the rattles and such like in the police van, there's a custody cage in the back, it's very loud inside the vans. Whether it's whilst I've been sort of taking my seatbelt off and getting out of the van or whatever, but I don't have any recollection of that transmission for Inspector Stewart.
Oh. Now, you were asked some questions about, sorry, just before we go there, you said to the chair that CS spray would be what you would use rather than your baton.
Yes.
Why would that be?
CS spray, the subject could be 12 feet away and it could be effective. A baton is the length of your arm, and what's a baton? 2.5 feet or something like that, so it's they've got to get closer to you, so there's the greater risk to you. Just the one time I used the baton, as I say, I got textbook calf strikes, and it just didn't have any effect on the guy. Yeah, I have seen other people smaller build than myself using a baton as well. I've yet to see somebody drop by getting hit by a baton.
You explained to senior counsel to the inquiry the occasion you used the baton,
Yeah.
and
May I interrupt? I'm very, very sorry to do so. I've just received a message that the stenographer is really in need of a break at the moment, and I'm very sorry. I appreciate that you may be nearing the end, but she is finding this difficult because she hasn't had a break.
Stopped doing the transcript bit, although she'll fill it in later. Well, If we take a 10-minute break just now, we'd still comfortably finish, wouldn't we?
Oh, yes.
Very well. Yes, Mr. McConaughey.
Thanks, sir. For the benefit of all concerned, I don't have very long to go at all. You were asked some questions about a complaint, and the one I'm interested in is the one in 2010, which involved, I think, the attempted execution of a warrant.
Yes.
Do you remember what sort of warrant it was? In the sense of, was it a search warrant, an arrest warrant?
I think it would be an apprehension warrant.
An apprehension warrant. And if I understood what you said previously, other officers, not you, other officers had attempted to execute that warrant prior to you attempting to execute it.
Yes.
And insofar as any instructions were concerned, there was nothing relating to those prior attempts which alerted you to any suggestion that there was an issue with regards to understanding.
That's correct.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about is the suggestion or the allegation from your grandfather that you made a particular comment to him. So far as your grandfather is concerned, am I right in thinking he is now deceased?
Yes.
Do you know when that was?
A year ago.
Oh.
Don't know.
At the time he provided a statement, he seems to have been aged 88 at that time. Yeah. Now, I don't want to delve into family disputes, but is it fair to say that there is something of a schism within the family?
Yeah.
And in particular, that is between yourself and your sister?
Yes.
And your sister's name is Karen Swan?
That's right.
And her husband's name is Barry Swan?
Yeah.
And they, I think, provided statements in relation to various matters,
Yes.
which you will have seen.
And they orchestrated the BBC media broadcast as well.
How long has that dispute been ongoing?
In 2005.
So, as we sit here now, some 17 years.
Yes.
Back in 2015, perhaps 10 years.
Yes.
And so far as that is concerned, am I right in saying that that has pretty much meant there's no relationship between yourself and your sister and her husband?
There is no relationship.
And indeed there was not in 2015?
No.
So far as your grandfather is concerned, if one wants to split it into two sides, as it were, which side was he on?
Karen and Barry's side.
And from a remark you made to senior counsel to the inquiry, did you consider he was influenced by them?
Yes.
As at August 2015, so I suppose shortly after the incident that we're interested in, how often were you seeing your grandfather?
Not very often. That was the first time I see him in 6 months, maybe.
On the day that you saw him, do you remember what you were actually doing?
I was in the bakery department of Morrison's, and we kind of struck up a conversation. He was telling me about he was looking for my sort of my police thoughts on a dispute he was having with a neighbour across the drive regarding a fence that had been built up the middle of the drive, and I was just he was asking how the kids are going, kids are and such like, and I was saying you'll have to come up and see the kids. So that was kind of how it left. It left on good terms.
When you say you said to him you'll have to come up and see the kids, this is your children you're
Yeah.
talking about. And at that time, how long was it since he had seen the children? Roughly.
a couple of years, maybe longer.
Right. Well, we're talking years.
Aye.
And your suggestion that you should come up and see the kids, well, was that some sort of attempt at reconciliation, as it were?
Yeah, aye. I hadn't fallen out with my granddad about anything, so he was more than welcome to come up to the house to see the kids or that.
And was there any discussion between you and him about your feelings towards black people or any other ethnic minority?
No, it's absolute nonsense.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Paton, thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the inquiry. When I rise, you'll be free to leave.
Thanks.
Before I hear any applications under Rule 9, I want to pick up on two matters. First, by way of explanation, when Mr. Paton was giving evidence about obtaining an interpreter, you heard another voice speak. That was the appropriate adult who was just trying to be helpful, but as senior counsel to the inquiry explained to her, she could not give evidence. The second matter is the reference to certain statements. In the course of his examination of Mr. Paton, his senior counsel, Mr. McConaughey, made reference to statements from two officers. These statements were obtained by the legal representative of Mr. Paton and were provided to the inquiry on the day before Mr. Paton's evidence was recorded. As I have said before, the inquiry is an inquisitorial inquiry which conducts its own investigations. I have discouraged core participants from providing to the inquiry statements of potential witnesses. On the other hand, I have encouraged core participants to suggest lines of investigation. I propose to treat these statements as a suggested line of investigation. The statements will not be disclosed at this stage. I shall take advice and consider whether further investigation of this matter by the inquiry would be likely to assist me in fulfilling the terms of reference. Now, are there any Rule 9 applications, Mr. Anwar? Anybody? Mr. Moyle? Nobody else? Right. Mr. Anwar, if you'd like to come to the table, please. And Mr. Moyle, there's a seat for you as well. Yes, Mr. Anwar.
Obliged, sir. Mr. Paton had stated in a statement, a PERC statement, I believe, that he stated, a quote, "Straight away I remembered that there had been a rumour going about Kirkcaldy Police Station that somebody intended to cause harm to a female cop." And he goes on to say that for a number of months, checks have also been carried out by officers at a number of identified locations in Kirkcaldy due to the increased terrorist risk. It also ran through my mind that this male could be part of a terrorist plot. Would submit, sir, that evidence suggests that there was no official warning with regards to a female officer, and we would also wish explored the identified locations in Kirkcaldy due to increased terrorist risk that Mr. Paton speaks of in his statement, and whether Hayfield Road was one of these locations. We'd also would request a question to be asked of him in relation to, did he make a link with terrorist plots when dealing with other knife incidents such as the one in the PDR 2012? In how many knife crimes did Mr. Paton press his emergency button? In how many knife crimes did he restrain those individuals to the ground? In how many of those did he deploy CS or Parva spray? And how many of those were black? Asian, or any other minority ethnic group. Earlier in his evidence, sir, he stated, let's face it, he was on a mission to try. His sole purpose in going on the streets with a knife was to try and find Syed Zaid, probably with the intention of killing him. It's important to state, sir, that nothing has been established about what was going through Sheikh Ubayo's mind that Sunday morning, but what we do know from evidence was that he was undergoing some form of a mental health crisis. The family put to Alan Paton in the form that there is no evidence establishing that Sheikh Ubayo was returning with the sole purpose of going on the streets with a knife to try and find Syed Zaid, probably with the intention of killing him. This witness has been given wide latitude, and I understand that is because of the claims or the evidence that's been provided that he suffers from post-traumatic stress syndrome. However, the family do not believe that he should be allowed to state wildly speculative statements without it being questioned. In relation to his statement to the inquiry, he states, from my statement, I was convinced he was breathing. I believe I saw the rise and fall of his chest. I also believe this was in keeping with my training. The question we would ask of Mr. Paton is, how was it possible to see the rise and fall of his chest if he was resisting? And if he had stopped resisting, what was done to monitor the breathing, and what was the correct procedure? Moving on to the issue of racist terminology, this witness was asked about the use of the term boy, which he has used throughout his statement. The boy continued to walk towards me with his palms open, facing me. He was smiling at Craig and wiped the CS spray off his face. The boy was face up. And he was also asked later on in the evidence about how much importance do you place on communication as a skill, as a tactic to de-escalate a situation. Well, I did try and communicate, but you've got to have it from the other side. If he's not engaging back with you, if he's not even telling you to fuck off on or you, Ken, it wasn't me, boss. Can Mr. Paton be asked, when you consider the use of the boy throughout to describe Mr. Bayu, which he denies has any racist connotation, combined with the words, it wasn't me, boss, could he be asked whether he would consider that to be accepted as being racist or offensive? On the issue of the assessments while travelling, whilst at the locus, he states that he saw Sheikh Ubayo walking towards him with palms facing upwards. In his perk statement 00262 at page 4, he states, with my spray in my right hand and pointing in the direction of the man, I shouted loudly and very clearly, get down on the ground. The guy was walking towards me and completely ignored me. He kept walking towards me with his palms out, and I remember thinking how crazy he looked and if he was on a mission. I was in genuine fear for my life, and at this point I pressed my red emergency button and shouted loudly, clearly, get down on the fucking ground. My shouting and pointing of my spray had absolutely no bearing on him, and he kept walking towards me, ignoring me as if he was in a one-track mind, and I was terrified and thought I was going to get attacked by him. The question we would wish further asked of Mr. Paton is, why did he assess Mr. Bayo, who continued to simply walk, as threatening? What exactly was it about this black man who appeared not to be registering any response that terrified Mr. Paton so much? On the basis that Mr. Paton himself was half a foot taller and some 5 stones heavier, armed with weapons that he could use, with backup on its way, and also a partner who was assisting him, who was 6'4" and 25 stones, PC Craig Walker. With regards to the action at the locus in relation to CS spray and Pavis spray, he states in evidence, I genuinely thought I was going to die. It goes in slow motion, and I had, when I was curled up, I had visions of your sides are exposed, the back of your neck's exposed. I expected a meat cleaver or a knife in the side of the neck, and then you start to have the thoughts, am I going to get home from my shift tonight? Am I going to see my wife again? Am I going to see my kids again? And that's what still causes me problems, eh? That's the main part of my PTSD that I just can't get out of my mind. You were thinking the worst, I was thinking the worst. The question that we would asked of Mr. Paton is, did Sheikh Ubayo take advantage of the vulnerability of Mr. Paton once the spray blew back into his eyes? It's a matter of fact that Sheikh Ubayo did not attack Mr. Paton. When the CS spray blew back into Mr. Paton's face, did he feel vulnerable to attack? Was he angry? And could he confirm it's simply the case that Mr. Paton carried on walking by him? In relation to the issue of restraint in evidence, he stated, "It was whilst I was still holding his bicep with the baton, I noticed there was no resistance with regard to him trying to lift up his arm. I am only really conscious of his arm. I could not really see the rest of the torso because of Craig's back. The guy did not speak or scream throughout the incident. So do you remember saying this to the perk at the time?" he was asked. And then he goes on in his evidence, "And you've talked about him aggressively fighting and resisting. Can you describe to us how he was moving when he was on the ground?" And he answers, "Just wriggling all over the place, and his arms were sort of, and his legs were flailing, and that's the best I can describe." And he's asked, how hard was he resisting? He was resisting, considering the size of the guys that were trying to stop him resisting, he was resisting a fair bit. And he's questioned, who were the guys that were trying to stop him resisting? Mr. Paton has said in his evidence and in his statements that Sheku Bayo was aggressively fighting, that he was resisting, and the question that the family wished asked of Mr. Paton is, did he ever think that Sheku Bayo might have been struggling because he could not breathe? He has already stated that Sheku Bayo never said a thing throughout the incidents. We know from the evidence of Kaylee Good, the civilian eyewitness, that she could hear screams that sent chills through her body and that she could hear loud screams of "get off me." We also heard from a police officer saying that Sheku Bayo was aggressively groaning. The family would wish questions asked about whether Sheku Bayo was making screaming noises, moaning noises, groaning noises, that PC Paton, Mr. Paton stated that he was resisting. Was he not saying anything? Would he accept it was possible that Sheku Bayo was struggling because he could not breathe? Did he hear him say the words "get off me" or "I can't breathe"? And sir, whilst I appreciate that you have on a previous occasion talked about the issue of Sheku Bayo being important and central to this case and talked of the totality of the evidence, we would submit that this is a critical police witness involved in the restraint of Sheku Bayo and should be asked these questions, as he gave such vivid explanations in his statements and in his evidence, and various claims that have been made that, as far as the family are concerned, are attempts to smear, to stereotype and to stigmatise Mr. Bayo. Mr. Paton goes on to state that Sheku Bayo was making no noise during the restraint. The question that we would wish to explore was with Mr. Paton was that because he was unconscious? If he did not believe he was unconscious, then the question that arises is, why did he slap him or pat him to the side of his face? Did Mr. Paton think that Sheku Bayo was faking it? The question that we would wish asked of this witness is that when Sheku Bayo's body is placed in the ambulance, why were the restraints and the handcuffs not removed? What was the correct method of restraint? And was he aware of the dangers of methods that he had used, including the use of his baton to restrain Sheku Bayo on the ground? In his Rule 8 statement, paragraph 59, he states, after giving the attending paramedics an update of the situation, I returned to my van. I have no knowledge of what they did thereafter. The question that we would wish explored from this witness is, why did he not tell the paramedics about the use of CS and Pava spray? Mr. Paton, throughout his evidence, repeatedly mentioned the use of flakka, which he knew from his research on YouTube or Google. If he was so well versed in the issue of flakka, why did he not mention it to the paramedics who attended, as this would have been a significant concern and a significant issue to raise with the paramedics? Did he not think that another question that the family wish raised is about the covering of Sheku Bayo's body before commencing CPR or part of his body after CPR was commenced to try and keep him warm? And if he was not covered, why not? In evidence earlier, Mr. Paton stated, when he was questioned, although he was lighter than you and PC Walker and smaller, what was it about him that made you describe him as large? Because he was large, he was black, and he was male. And he's questioned again, why you say he was large? What do you mean by that? His physique, his muscles, his neck muscles, his biceps, his chest. So he was a steroid user, so he was pumped out repeatedly through his evidence. Mr. Paton has stated about the use of steroids. He has not been asked the question that it was impossible for Mr. Paton to say if Sheku Bayo had ever used steroids and how he would know of this on the 3rd of May 2015. The family would wish this witness questioned on who provided him this piece of information. Was it the Scottish Police Federation? Was it the PERC? Was it Police Scotland? And if so, when? The family want these areas examined on the basis of there is a need to explore the racist stereotyping here and the attribution of superhuman strength. Each officer up until now has denied the stereotypes whilst maintaining the use of them, and is essential that the responses of previous witnesses are not used by the chair to prejudge police officers that follow, but for each officer to be tested and explored on such stereotypes. Otherwise, how else can the inquiry investigate if institutional racist culture is at play? The Angeloni Review of Deaths and Serious Incidents in Police Custody in 2017 in brief states the stereotyping...
Mr. Anwar, I really have to interrupt you there, I'm sorry, but what I'm wanting from you is an indication of a line of questioning that counsel to the inquiry should ask at any continued hearing. I don't need justification by way of reference to Angelini report.
Hold up. Yeah.
So you can bear that in mind in anything further you have to say.
I'm obliged, sir. I'll move on. In relation to exploring the questions, the return to the station, as soon as Mr. Paton is back at the station, he spoke to Austin Barrett, who was a Scottish Police Federation representative. Craig Walker had asked him to arrange for Federation representative as he believed that they would require it. The question that we wish explored from Mr. Paton is, did he or Craig Walker state to Austin Barrett that they had killed a man, and what was meant by this? Why did they need a Federation representative, and what did they think that they could do to help him? He states, when I arrived at the office, I went upstairs and changed out of my uniform as it had been contaminated by CS spray and Pava spray. I put my CS spray back into the locker along with my airwave radio. I put my uniform in the locker room 4 outside my locker. The question we would wish explored from this witness is, did he not think that these items may be important as evidence that would require to be preserved and examined? Mr. Paton spoke in his evidence. I remember going into the station. I went into the station because Stephen House had been called to a meeting. Whether that was just an excuse to get everybody to go, I don't know. We are aware from previous evidence, and the family is aware, that there was a meeting with Chief Constable Stephen House, and they would wish explored from this witness. When did that happen? And when did that happen, and what happened at that meeting? Moving on from that, he states, I don't remember seeing any other officers discharge CS or Pava spray at the man, although I believe that Ashley did from a conversation after the event. We would wish a question asked, what else was discussed? When did that conversation take place? Moving on to the issue of Mr. Paton's family, in the PERC statement 00468 at page 5 of 8, Karen Swan, his sister, said that Alan Paton wished to join the British National Party, a racist Nazi organisation, when he was 16 years old. She also spoke of his racist...
Mr. Anwar, I have to interrupt you again here. These are matters which will, if they're to be explored at all, will be explored separately. They may be collateral matters, but this witness cannot himself comment on something that his sister is said to have said.
Well, the basis of that was on this witness has been asked about his grandfather, William Paton, and the allegations he's made, and his sister, Karen Swan, who I understand will be a witness in the future, or suspect will be a witness in the future, also has made a statement to the inquiry, and has made a statement to the PERC, and it's on that basis I was wishing that question asked. But I will move on, sir. His counsel, senior counsel, or Mr. Paton spoke of the orchestration of the BBC News. Following the BBC News item, the family would wish to ask whether any of the allegations of racism made against him, whether he was contacted by the professional standards at Police Scotland in relation to that matter. They wish asked of this witness that Mr. Paton's wife, Pamela, in her statement says that he happily bumped into his granddad in Morrison's and had invited him to the house. And the question the family would wish asked, if he was on such good terms with Mr. Paton Sr., why would he suddenly make up such an allegation? Again, sir, you may wish this to be addressed. at different stages of these proceedings how the family wished this raised. They state that Karen Swan, in her statements to the PERC, stated that there was an Asian family who Mr. Paton used to make racist remarks to when he was a young man and he wanted to join the BNP, and that his mother...
Mr. Anwar, you're just repeating the matter that I suggested that you shouldn't explore at this stage.
I'll move on. So. I'll simply close in relation to the matter about hating all blacks and the terms and the racist terminology that's been used. Would submit that it's essential that these matters are explored at length. This isn't the usual required nuanced and layered approach that's been adopted in dealing with all police officers, but it's direct evidence of overt racism, which Mr. Paton, his grandfather, has given evidence, and also there are statements being taken from his family. I understand that my learned friend may also have questions that cross over. I'll wait to see what he says.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Anwar. Mr. Moore?
Sir, I have 2 points I would wish the Chair to consider. The first relates to a paragraph in PERC Statement 00396 at page 9, and I think it's the paragraph that starts off, Karen and I discussed these events. Now, I draw a distinction here between my friend Mr. Anwar's comment about the British National Party and the comments on that, and it doesn't relate to that, my Lord. What it relates to are direct comments attributed to Mr. Paton by Mr. Shaw, his brother-in-law. This is a statement from him, where he indicates that Mr. Paton, in the early years, had made a number of jovial and humorous jokes. He didn't consider there to be vindictiveness in them himself, but the reference to the jokes were, and I quote, "that black bastard," or "the Packy jokes." I never challenged them because I perceived it as a laugh. I didn't ever feel that he meant the comments. These are jokes, however, that I would submit to the Chair are wholly inappropriate jokes for a police officer to be making, albeit he wasn't no doubt a police officer at that time, but they perhaps give some insight into his mental attitude, and they were comments that were made directly to the witness by Mr. Paton. So that's the first thing I would wish counsel to the inquiry to consider asking, and the Chair to consider allowing to be done. And the second matter, sir, relates to the transcript from today at page 166 leading into 167, where counsel to the inquiry asked, how confident, looking back, how confident were you in the training you had received? You have made comments earlier today about the training in relation to the handling of an incident of this sort. How confident were you in the training that you had in equality, diversity matters relating to race? He goes on to say, I think it probably could be improved, if I'm being honest. Maybe every 2 years or something like that would be handy. And the question is, so maybe more than, and done for the right purposes, for the right reasons. I think they could probably do more, because I mean, I've heard some people that have given, and then there's a check point there, Tully Allen, well, that's not really acceptable in my opinion. Everyone likes a wee day out course. And then it goes on to say, maybe more regular training, but not rammed down your throat, not every year, something every 2 years would be enough. Now, I would ask that this whole passage of evidence is explored, because the implication that's being made there is that Mr. Paton is implying that he may think there'll be maybe wrong purposes for equality, diversity and race training, and the reference, so how much more regular training, the reference to not rammed down your throat, perhaps implies a hostility towards ethnicity, diversity and race training, my Lord. So I would like that further explored and expanded upon, if possible, my Lord.
Thank you, Mr. Moyer. Well, given the time, I'll consider these submissions overnight and I'll give my decision tomorrow morning.